A little while ago, I wrapped up this animation of the demon encounter with the knight, and it involved a little bit of tail animation. And so what I did is I finished the main movement of the actual character, and then I went through and just did the tail as a final pass because a lot of it is dependent on the movement of the demon. Like, for example, this is the demon falling down and then landing, and so the tail kind of needs to accompany that motion. However, while I was working, I kind of hit a roadblock where I was really scratching my head on how I should do this, because in my case in particular, I have this type of rig where it's literally just a chain of bones, chain of joints with their own controllers on each joint. If you're familiar with animating like spines and stuff like that, you like to do things in bulk. Like you'll grab all these and move them at once, for example. But for a tail, there's so much like secondary, tertiary movement going on that if you were to animate it like this, it would look pretty stiff. And so I was like, darn, did I just kind of back myself into a corner where I have to go through and animate every single joint along with this movement to get that kind of, tail movement that looks natural, where there's kind of a start of movement and then the rest is kind of a follow through of movement. So I was really scratching my head, worrying that I would have to spend another couple hours kind of slaving over all of these individual joints and dealing with all their individual curves and everything. So I played around with a couple techniques and a couple ideas I was having, because I know that there's better ways to rig a tail. This is just the way I rigged the tail to begin with, because I rigged it so long ago. I wasn't even thinking about the actual purpose of the character yet until just now when I laid out the cutscene and everything. So essentially, I'm stuck with this rig unless I want to redo anything. And so what I did figure out, I'm actually pretty happy with. As you can see, the end result is kind of nice and fluid. And I really didn't do all that much extra work to get this effect. And so what I want to do is walk you through the process that I did with this type of rig, because I feel like this is kind of a common case scenario for tails, is just a chain of joints with little controllers on them. And so to achieve this effect, I actually broke it down in a really helpful way that I think could help you in any kind of similar scenario like this. If you're animating a tail or, tentacles or anything like that, I think this would work just fine for that sort of thing. So before I break it down like that, let me just kind of show you what I have to work with right now. And the way I usually set up my scenes is I have the character all rigged, and then I create these little controller groups in here so I can quick select things. For example, I have a whole spine section here, so if I need to quickly grab the spine joints, I can do that like this, and then now I have access to all the spine joints, no problem. And so I did the same thing with the tail. So I have a demon tail set right here, and as you can see, it's actually 8 joints, which is quite a lot to kind of deal with, and a little overwhelming to imagine animating the tail joint by joint with 8 joints, because you need to have movement on all these joints to make it look fluid, but you don't want to go in on every joint and animate them. So what I actually ended up doing was kind of stopping and thinking like, okay, what are we actually dealing with here? And it just got me thinking like, okay, so the basics of animation are kind of, you have your main animation and then you have a secondary animation. And in some cases, a tertiary animation, and then whatever you call the fourth animation. And with the tail, that's all present here. So what I ended up thinking was like, okay, so I'm going to first just animate the movement for the base joint and just get all that down. That's going to be the principal movement for the tail. So for example, as this character is falling, it's pointing upwards because, gravity or the wind or whatever is pulling the tail upwards. And then but after it lands, it comes down and follows through. If you're just paying attention to just this joint, it has its own kind of follow through with the way the character is moving. And so there's a bit of a little bounce there. And then it kind of props back up because the character's still in control of the tail. It's not totally limp or anything. So basically that was my first idea, is just to get this down and then handle the rest of it later. To avoid having to do that for every single joint, I thought I should just break this up into little groups. So I'm only animating this one tail individually, and the rest I'm combining to create kind of a smooth bend in the tail as we go along. And I'll explain this with a little drawing afterwards. So basically I looked at the tail and I was like, okay, how few groups can I actually get this done with? Because I can obviously animate this first joint and get that first movement. And then I could potentially just grab everything else after that and create the secondary movement. But then you get this kind of like stiff look to your animation. You have a nice follow through, secondary animation and all that, but it still ends up looking kind of stiff. And so let me actually explain what I ended up with. I went through and grabbed as few joints as I could for the different sections of the tail. And I ended up breaking it down into 4 main groups. So let me explain it by drawing it out. Okay, so here I have the joints all listed out 1 through 8. And we've already established that the first joint is going to be animated independently. So that's going to be essentially our first group. And this is going to be our primary animation. And after that, what's going to be following directly after the movement of the first joint is going to be, I just broke these up into groups that I felt were looking the best. So I settled on these next 2 here, 2 and 3, to be our secondary. And then because I knew that the last 2 joints here on the tail, basically this tuft of hair here on the character's tail, was going to be the final secondary movement, I knew to break those right off into their own little group. And this is the final or last part of animation that I'll use here. And so that left me with kind of an awkward number here, just a group of 3. And so I took these, and these will be the tertiary movement group. So this is essentially how I broke it down. And, you know, the number of joints that you have might vary. Maybe you want to do groups of all 3, groups of all 2. Because I had 8 and I had these conditions where I wanted the first one to be its own group and the last 2 to be their own group. I had to settle on this, and it worked out pretty well. So now that we have these groups, essentially what I did with these is I made sure that whenever I was posing the character, I did so in these groups, and I made sure that each joint within each group was animated the same, essentially. So I didn't have a bunch of haywire curves and a bunch of random values and stuff that I could lose track of and that were having influence over the tail as it was moving. I had instead just these 4 concise groups, and each group essentially acted as an individual joint for me. To make it maybe a little easier to understand, for example, let's just take this second group here, this 2 and 3. What I would do in the animation is I would take 2 and 3, and from here, I would only ever animate them exactly the same. So I get a nice bending, but they don't diverge from each other. They're always the same rotation values and everything. So when I actually go into the curves editor and look at the curves of these 2 joints, it's actually pretty simple. This is 2 joints I'm selecting here, but all I see is the rotate Y and rotate Z for each of them. They're exactly the same, and I can just deal with them as though they're one joint. That just makes the whole thing a lot more convenient, as opposed to having each of these joints with their own wild curves doing all kinds of things, and I have to kind of customize them. This just makes it easier to parse, essentially. And so this is the solution I came up with, and it actually worked out really well. It made the animation process a lot faster, and I could go through each of the parts of the animation, add the tail movement with the first joint, and add all the follow through, all the secondary movement with my following groups without having to deal with 8 joints. I instead was just essentially dealing with 4 joints, which is just a lot easier. Something I usually do, you know, with the spine usually has around 3 or 4 joints. So something a lot more approachable in general for the tail. And so as you can see, if you look at the movement, even though it's only 4 groups I'm using, it's still utilizing the bending of all the joints at once. And making a nice smooth movement with the type of follow through you'd expect from a tail. So essentially the final part of the tail is the last thing to move, and you get a nice movement there. All right, so now I actually want to put this process into practice and show you step by step how I would animate this tail. So I've gone through and I deleted the animations for the tail for this little portion here. So it's just a straight default position here. To begin, let's start off with our first group, which is just this tail number 1 controller. And we're going to do the primary motion, the primary movement. And to make it even simpler, I'm just going to be dealing with 1 axis at a time. I'll tell you right now, we're only going to be using 2 of the rotation axes because the Z axis, the tail doesn't rotate like that. That's just not how tails rotate usually. So we're going to completely ignore that. And we're just going to be focusing on the X, which is the up and down, which of course we'll need for this landing animation. And then the Y, which is a side to side, which I will use to kind of add a little swing to the tail, kind of like the creature is actually swinging its tail as it's landing. And so it's not all physics controlled. It doesn't look like a limp tail. It looks like there's some life in the tail. So let's get started with our first group. We're going to go through this whole portion here just with the first group, which is tail number 1. And starting off right here, I'm going to lift this up here and key that. That's the rotate X. So as the creature is falling, the tail is pointing up, which makes sense, right? Because it's being pulled up by the wind or, physics. And then it's going to continue like that until we kind of reach a landing point. But because the tail is secondary to the creature, I'm going to go a little after the landing here. So I'm going to key that there. And then just after, this tail is going to shoot down to follow through with the momentum of the creature. So this is going to come right down. And then it's going to spring back up because there's a little bit of resistance there. We want to make sure that the tail doesn't seem limp or anything because it's still being controlled by a creature. So I'm going to pull this up here just at the very end here. Maybe up a little further, and then let's see if we want to do more of a bounce here. Yeah, I'll come back down a little bit more with this. That's not bad. I don't think that's too bad. But I'm going to actually go back down a little bit again for a little more of a bounce there. So let's see how that looks. That's not bad. We can adjust the actual height later if we find that this direction for the first joint is a little too high. We can always grab this group of anchor points and move it around if we want the final resting point to be a little lower or something. We can maintain our bounce, but just have it resolve a little lower. But for now, I'm going to keep it straight out. There. So that's pretty good for the first one. You can kind of get an idea of like the weight and the actual movement and everything. And it looks natural aside from the thing sticking straight out. So now we're going to move on to our second group, which is 2 and 3, and we're going to animate kind of reacting to the movement of the first joint there. So it's going to be secondary to the primary movement. Actually, to start out, I'm going to just tilt it up a little bit because I think we should start by smoothing out that curve. And then, of course, the next group is going to curve that even more, so we want to keep that in mind not to go too far because I think the third group there will kind of be the end of that curve, and then the end of the tail will stick straight up. So I'm not going to go too far with that, but I'm going to key that there. I'm going to come down with the character. And as that's falling, because it's a secondary movement, I'm going to key it here just to pin that. As it's being pulled down by that first joint, it's going to curve up a little bit more. So it's kind of following, its secondary movement. It's following through there. And then as the first tail joint starts going back up, this part actually wants to go down. See that bending there, that secondary movement. And then once again, as it falls back down, it's going to find its default place here. And then finally, it's going to come down to its resting position, which we're just going to make kind of curve down. So I think the final pose that I imagine for this tail and what I sort of remember from what it was animated like before is the tail sticks out straight from the base of the back, curves down, and then the last couple groups kind of curve back up to create this kind of S curve here. So hopefully we can end up in that position without too much struggling. As you can see, we got a lot of bounce going on here. So maybe I want to remove this upward motion. Yeah, we'll see how it goes. Hopefully I can get this to look as good as it was before. Actually, maybe I want to go back to the first joint and bring that down a little bit, just so the end result is more of that S curve that I'm looking for. That's pretty good. It still looks a little stiff there to me, but maybe once we get the next group in there, we'll have a better feel for the way it's going to actually look in the end. But now we have the first group done, the second group done, only 2 more groups to do. And just like that second group was following the first group, this third group of 3 is going to follow the second group. And so once again, we're going to start at the top of this animation. We're going to finally get that nice curve for this pose here, because that looks a little better, doesn't it? And the same thing, we're going to come right down here. It's going to fall down. And this point is actually I'm going to pin it here just so it maintains that straightness there. And then we're really going to get a nice curve here as it's swinging the tail down like that. And so what you'd expect is a pretty quick snap downward here. Let's see. Looks a little quick. Maybe I need to move this key down a little bit. And then as it's coming back up, it's going to be bending backwards. And then it's going to be finding its final pose, which is more of a curve here. And then maybe I'll add a little bit of a resting bend. So as it finds its final position, it comes to like a little bouncy rest there. And as it clips through the ground there, because you don't want to see that in the final animation, that will actually be more or less solved by when we add in the Y rotation, because the Y rotation will be affecting this axis here. It'll be swinging left and right as it lands. So I'll cover that like kind of clipping by just pushing the tail left or right as it lands. We'll see. Right now we're just getting the basic movement down. I think that looks pretty good for now. Maybe this is a little too abrupt here. So I'm gonna make it a little subtler. So that's okay. Let's see how it looks in real time. Looks okay. It's a little quick, but this tutorial should be quick. So let's not dwell on it. We can always change the timing, you know, if you want to space these curves out a little differently. That's totally something you can do by grabbing, you know, each of the groups and moving them around. But for now, I'm just going to go with what I can manage right now. So that's looking okay, right? It's not too bad. The animation actually ends a little sooner than we're going to end, because you see the camera starts to focus on the main character there getting pushed back by the wind force. So all this is kind of extra stuff that no one will see anyway. But to finish off the animation and feel good about it, we're going to go all the way with it. And what's next is the very last group, where we'll animate this little tip of the tail and the tuft of hair there. So let's do that same thing. We're going to start way up here at the first pose. I actually don't think we need to do too much here because no one sees it. And also I think it would just be straight up and down anyway. So let's come back down here for the landing, where this group kind of bends lastly following the third group. So we're going to make this curve as it's falling down to complete that nice round curve. And then this gets slapped down here. And then as it's going to go up, we're going to kind of do a generous bend backwards, because it really is the final follow through secondary motion element to this tail. So it's going to be bending contrary to the third group here. And then as the tail kind of settles, this is going to bend back up. It's a lot of our secondary motion instinct as animators, just to kind of feel it out and see where we feel these sorts of changes in direction should take place. Let's see, I might have to just fix the timing here. Yeah, that last part there is too quick for me, for my taste. So I'm going to grab the third group here. Let's see what happens. It goes up and then down kind of too quick, I think. I'm actually going to start from here, I think, grab everything. Now we can see all of the Rotate X transforms that we've made. I'm just going to extend this just to make it not so quick, I guess. Let's just see what that looks like. I don't really know what's going to happen here. Okay, so now everything's in time with each other, so we get all the movement in the right pacing, but it's a slower recovery there. So I think that looks a little better. And all I did was grab everything and move it over. Because if you do one at a time, just moving one group at a time, it's going to desynchronize from your pattern that you have, or the relationship between the different groups. So you kind of want to do everything uniformly. So I think that looks a little better. It's not as quick at the end there. And now maybe I can take the third group and give it another extra bounce here. I think if I do that extra bounce, it'll help this tail and secondary movement have a little more to it. Because now I can follow and add a little more detail there. Let's see what that looks like. Looks okay. I'm going to stretch this out just a touch. It looks bad. Hold on. Let me see if I can fix this. I think I want this to come up a little later, maybe. Okay. It's not great. I don't really love it, but I think this little portion here will be kind of masked when we go in with the Y rotation. And since we've reached the end of our groups, that's all groups have been finished in the X rotation. Take one more look at that. We can go in with the Y rotation and give it a little more character, a little more interest. So let's see, it's going to be pretty straight as it lands, but I want it to kind of, as this curve is happening, I want the character to be kind of pushing the tail left and right to give it a kind of swinging motion. That's what I did for the actual animation. I think it looks kind of cool. So let's start back again with tail 1, and we'll do the pass for the Y rotation here. And that should be it once we're finished with that. So I'll start this Y rotation around here, kind of where the X rotation starts, and we'll see, we can play with it if we need. So as this comes down, I'm gonna have this swing back and forth. It's too quick, it's okay, we can time it out differently if we need. It's gonna be a simple just wag back and forth, so it's gonna return to 0 here for the final position. And let's just make this a little more subtle. Let's see, maybe I want to start a little earlier actually. Yeah, I think that's better. And so now we have a little left and right movement to follow along. So we'll go just as we did with X rotation. We'll select the next group in the chain, which is 2 and 3. And we will move with this Y movement now, that we have this new movement to follow. So it's going to be pushed over there to the right. And as it does that, we're going to follow it with a little bit of delay. So I'm going to move this way as it's being kind of pulled along by that first joint. And then as it reaches that, just as it passes that point where it starts coming back the other way, we're going to switch it around and bend it this way. And then it goes back to center, so we're going to also accompany that with a little delay. So we're going to move that over. And then we are going to go back to our resting point, which is 0. We could always rest on a different point as well if we want the final pose to be kind of a different shape. I think I did that in the actual animation too, where the resting pose was kind of an S-curve here in this way as well. I think it was just so that if you look from the front, you can still see like maybe the tuft of the tail sticking out. So let's see, maybe we'll end up doing that as well. Yeah, maybe I'll just do that for demonstration purposes. So in that case, instead of finishing at 0, we're actually going to finish at an angle here. And I think that'll allow us to finish on kind of a little curve. So group 2, we're going to go back here and adjust it as needed. So this, I think, is a little fast. What's happening here? Oh, I see what the problem is. I need to pin this movement first, so let me do that. I forgot to add a little point here so we don't get any movement before the landing. So I'm going to bring this back up to 0. So now we're actually going to start the animation here. All right, so this is looking okay for now, and we can always go back and adjust this curve. And since it is just this one curve for both these joints, it's easier. So I'm just going to go right over to the third group here and see if maybe that helps the look of this once I get that Y rotation in there. Starting about here, I'll pin this so it doesn't move before. And then as it's coming down, I see I'm getting my tail wag. And so I want to follow that movement. And then it comes back from there, and pretty much the same as we did with X. I'm kind of regretting this last little flick I have here at the end because it doesn't seem like it's natural movement. Yeah, that little last bounce, I'm going to get rid of that. And that is the third group here, the X translation. It's this last little bounce. I'm just going to delete it. And it's going to end up being curved up here a little more. And also the final group has a little bounce as well at the end. I'm going to get rid of that. It's all going to kind of settle like this. And lastly, we will animate the Y for this fourth group here, which is going to be the same old thing, just following the third group. We'll have to start a little earlier because there's some movement happening here. So I will push that over there because it seems like that's kind of where that's going. And just pose it so it looks kind of right. It's going to go back around here. It comes back up a little bit. And then here it's going to curve back the other way. Something like that, I guess. And then what happens at the end here? I guess it can kind of stay there. And we're still getting all this clipping through the ground, so I'm going to go back through. I think this is group 3. It's just going down a little too far. So I'm just going to make this animation a little more subtle, I think. Just kind of soften up these curves a little bit. And maybe even make this curve here not go down as far, because it goes down quite a bit. So I'm going to bring this all up here. Oh man, the end of that tail looks crazy. It's this Y here. I don't see any other opportunity to add Y movement here. I mean, I feel like this should go this way a little more, and then maybe it'll reach its resting place here at 0 again. No, I'll leave it curved a little bit to follow that, like, that S pose that we have here for the final pose. It actually looks like it slaps its tail on the ground. I'm not sure what. Yeah, it looks like it's hitting the tail on the ground, which wasn't intended. I think that's because it was so quick. Here, let's go to group, let's see. I'll go to group 3 here. Let's see what happens here. Maybe it's group 2 actually. Yeah, you can see this like really quick fall here. Maybe that's causing some of the weird effects. So since I'm moving this forward, I actually have to kind of change the rest of the X curves just so they line up still. Actually, I think I have to change all the curves. Let's grab all of it, scooch this all down a little bit. Just delay that a little bit so we don't get that hard slap on the ground. Yeah, it's a little better. There's something. It's definitely funny, but you know. There. Let's see what it looks like. It still looks like it's slapping the ground. Yeah, what is with that? I think now group 3 has to have more of a curve to it as it's going down. Yeah, that's better. And just check it out from all the different angles to make sure it's looking okay. Maybe this goes a little too far. Just a matter of feeling it out. That end pose, maybe I should just extend it a little bit more so this first joint can rotate back to here again. But I mean, that's also something that I might consider for like a final animation or something. But for now, this is the base of it. And as you can see, you get that nice like follow through with the way the tail curves and everything. Obviously, this isn't quite as polished as I'd like it to be. It just sort of ended up that way. But if you spend more time on these sorts of things, obviously you can get some nicer effects. But that's the basic of it. Taking all these different joints, just kind of compartmentalizing them, breaking them down into these smaller groups so you can have less to work with. It's less demanding for your attention while you're working. It takes a little less energy to keep track of all the different things. So, and I think with this technique, you can get some pretty good animation, some pretty good natural looking tail movement. I don't like what I came up with here as much as I wish I did, but I mean that's making tutorials. I'm trying to explain as I go along, so it's not necessarily going to be perfect, but yeah, it's like it's clipping through the ground and everything. Like, what is he doing? Does he even know what he's talking about? But anyway, yeah, that's the process I came up with. It was a nice little lifesaver for me, especially because I was really kind of scratching my head on how to do this sort of thing before. So yeah, breaking it down into those 4 groups really helped. Also making sure I'm doing one axis at a time, just breaking it down to its most basic components, which I think kind of you can say for any part of animation, doing broad strokes first and then going in with finer details or going through in passes and doing things. So hopefully you can kind of see this as a nice application for something you're trying to work on now, and it could help you out in the future on a project of your own. It was a nice little solution for myself. I was happy to come up with it, and it helped me through this process of finishing this animation. So I imagine you might be able to find some value in it yourself. So yeah, just a quick tutorial, just something simple, just to show the workflow that I used for the tail, and maybe give you some sort of inspiration for how to approach something in the future. So I hope that you found it valuable, and thanks for watching. And yeah, thank you.